Hello, this is Decelerated Dragon, or Wesley Crusher on Reddit, and this is my first chess video tutorial. I posted on Reddit asking for advice for video topics to do, and overwhelmingly people wanted tips for opening, both specific openings and just openings in general, the ideas behind openings. So I thought for my first video, I would try to just explain what the concepts as much as possible, the general concepts are for openings. Obviously, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of major unique openings, each with unique ideas. But of course, there are also general principles that you can apply in pretty much all of them to have a good idea of the opening and a transition to the middle game. So before I get started, I'd like to give a shout out to King's Crusher and Chess Explained for being the two kind of chess gurus who really have helped me out and inspired me to do this, to follow in their footsteps and do these chess tutorials. So many thanks for the hard work you do. Um, so yeah, just get started. The opening that I've chosen and variations is just basically, I think, the one that kind of demonstrates in the most straightforward manner the ideas of most mainline openings, and that is just the open game. White plays e4, the most popular, definitely at the club level and probably all the way down, with d4 being a close second. It leads to the open game, and it kind of presents the ideas of the opening and even the middle game in a much less subtle fashion. The d4 openings, which are often closed and more subtle and not so clear what the ideas are, at least at the amateur level. And so obviously Black now has a number of replies, each with their own kind of flavor and style. But again, I'm just going to pick what probably is the most popular one, which is just e5, playing the king's pawn game. And so, what is the idea here? E4, it controls the center, and that is one of the three main principles of the opening, along with developing your pieces to active squares and getting your king to safety. And so obviously E4 contributes to two of those, and even the third one indirectly. It occupies E4 and it controls D5 and C and F5, two of the most important squares of the center. And of course, it also prepares for development. It opens the diagonal for the white bishop and for the queen. Whereas any other move would not achieve those things all to the same degree. D4, the second most popular one, it also controls key central squares, and it opens up the dark square bishop and a file for the queen. And so that's the second most popular move. But e4 probably is, more tactical, more played towards an aggressive, fast development and opening. E5 just, meets that headlong, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. E5 by black stops the aggression of that pawn center, prevents it from advancing, and it does the same thing, opens up diagonals for the queen and the bishop. And so now at this point, by far the most common reply by white is knight f3, which develops a piece while simultaneously threatening the pawn. And so it's always good in the opening to develop with a threat. And that gains a tempo because now your opponent, instead of being able to do whatever they would want to do, has to in some way respond to this threat. So they're playing your game, and they might not. They might be doing moves that are suboptimal while doing so. And then again, almost overwhelmingly, the response is going to be knight to c6, but other moves are also playable, like d6, or even knight to f6, or stuff along those lines. And at this point, I read a book, or parts of a book, I think it was by Ruben Fine, called The Ideas Behind the Chess Openings. And basically how he laid it out was, for the e4, e5, the king pawn game, White's main goal is going to be attacking e5 and, along the same lines, trying to prepare d4. Because basically, one of the general ideas of what makes a strong opening position is the classical pawn center, and that is having two pawns side by side in the center, e4 and d4 for white, e5 and d5 for black. This is the classical pawn center and is considered to be, in most cases, a plus for the person who has it. Obviously, it can also be a liability, as the player who has that strong pawn center has to be able to support it. the other player's goal will almost invariably be to destroy that pawn center, to undermine it, or just to destroy it entirely. And so in some lines, white or black will play to defend his pawn center, which right now is e5, and that's what knight to c6 does. But the other strategy that Fine mentions in his book, the ideas behind the major openings, I think is what it's called, or something along those lines. The other option besides defending the pawn on e5 with a move like knight to c6 or e6, those are all moves that would they call them the stronghold. I think is one major line is to defend this e5 pawn against the attacks by white, so that black can have an equal share of the center. Again, one of the three key principles being control of the center. And then the other attack is called counter. Is the counterattack is not to try to defend your own pawn on e5, but to counterattack your opponent's pawn. And so moves that would do that would be the Russian defense or the Petrov defense, knight to f6, or even some weirder moves like f5, which is the Latvian gambit, I believe, or even d5, the elephant gambit, I believe. And these are either gambits because they often entail sacrifices by black to really get an immediate kind of lead in development and maybe attack the king. But typically, again, the main line openings for the king pawn game at least are white plays to attack the e5 pawn and black plays to defend it. And so now I'm going to continue with, again, the most popular move, and probably objectively the best move, which is just bishop to b5. And this is the Spanish game, or the Ruy Lopez. So what's going on here? How does this further white's goals in the opening? Clearly, it develops a piece, and it prepares castling. The bishop is out, and so now the next move, if he chooses to, white will castle. It also furthers white's goal of controlling the center indirectly because it attacks the knight. If the knight disappears, if the bishop captures the knight, all of a sudden the black's e5 pawn has no defender, and the knight can just grab it up. Now, we might see some lines in which that happens, and some lines in which it doesn't. It all depends on how black chooses to play. The most popular response, there's two main lines here in which black can respond to this. One of them is just knight to f6, and again, this is the counterattacking idea of Reuben Fine. Either black can choose to try to preserve and reinforce the e5 pawn, or alternatively, black can choose to go against and go after the e4 pawn and turn it into a counterattacking style play. And then in this usually the open Sicilian. At this point, black usually chooses to castle, and or white chooses to castle, sorry, and then if black takes the pawn on e4, then we get into a very kind of complex tactical position called, the open Spanish game, or I think it's what's called the open variation. And believe it or not, the most popular move, I believe, rather than just immediately playing rook to e1 to either attack simultaneously the knight and the pawn, actually a better move probably is simply d4. And I believe what this accomplishes is, it tries to, if black captures with the pawn, then I believe he's going to be a knight down, because this rook, over on e1 now is pinning the undefended knight. So black can, either unpin the knight, but then will be captured, or black can attempt to free or to defend the knight, but then I believe if he tries to do that, you can just play something like knight to g5. The queen can't capture because the bishop is defending. The knight can't capture because it's pinned. So your only choice again is to either unpin, in which case the knight will be captured, or add another defender. But notice at this point now, the pawn is free to really, pin it and win it. And so now at this point, I believe black would be a pawn down because he cannot move the knight, and the pawn will take it the next move. So instead of playing, where was I? Instead of playing rook e1 right away, d4 is often played, and you can see capturing that pawn right away, is not a good idea for for black. And so again, I'm not super familiar with this opening, but I believe what black chooses to do is play d5, and then this leads to a very complex tactical battle here with lots of very complicated variations. but it's too wild for me to explain in this shorter video. But that's one option there, and that demonstrates, White's idea, which is again to control the center, castle early, and develop the pieces, and then Black's key idea there, if he decides not to to defend the stronghold, then he will choose the counterattack, and he did so there by playing by taking the pawn right away. So now, of course, another option is if Black is not, or sorry, if White does not want to allow the pawn to be defended, you could always just play d3 and defend the pawn. But it's just kind of passive, because as you can see in those lines, White will get the pawn back if he castles and allows Knight takes e4. And yeah, this line right here, it's good for White, but it's not very popular. I think it's a little bit too passive because again, White is going to want to play d4 there, because d4 is the classical pawn center, and that is what White aims for. Alright, so let's go back now. The other major continuation, other than knight to f6, which is the counterattacking, is this little, what seems like a sideline move, but is actually, it's actually part of the main line right now. It's just tickling the bishop on an a6. And so again, that puts the question to this bishop. It says, do you really want to take that knight? Or do you want to maybe move to a different square where you are not undermining? Or do you maybe want to back up to a4? And the most popular move by far is to back up to a4. Because the bishop, it went to b5, it intends to at least provide pressure on that knight to give White the opportunity to capture that knight at a suitable time and maybe win the pawn. But now, you might be asking, well, why can't Black or White just capture the knight right away? And then no matter what Black does, this pawn is hanging, and it seems like White is up a pawn for free, in the first 4 or 5 moves. But this is where Black has an interesting little tactical kind of bomb here, which is capturing with the d pawn, which actually, violates one of the general principles of chess, which is to capture towards the center. But this is a great case of when not to capture towards the center is if you have this key file that you want to open up. Because as you can see, if White is greedy and takes the pawn, then Black will get it back immediately with a fork. And there's 2 options for the fork. So, inspired by King's Crusher, I'll give you 10 seconds to see if you can find one or both of these possibilities that Black has to regain the material and maybe even take some initiative. So 10 seconds. And of course, if you want more, you can just pause the video. Alright, so the main one that I play, if this ever happens, and I do play the Spanish game as Black, is queen to d4, forking the e4 pawn and the knight. Obviously, White cannot defend both of them. The knight cannot move to defend the pawn, so the knight has to retreat, and you get the e-pawn with check, with a tempo. And this is pretty much better for Black, actually. You can see he's already equalized. Ancients recommend just retreating with the knight, and then when the queen captures, you have to block with the queen, and that's just not good. Block with the queen, and you get the queen, and then the king can't even castle anymore. So it's very bad for Black, even though it seems like you win the pawn for free. Right on this line where you seem like you win the pawn for free. This is the main line response. This queen to d4, and that wins the pawn with check. The other option that the Indian doesn't like quite as much, the other fork, is queen to g5, forking the knight and this exposed g2 pawn. And so again, the knight has to go back, and then the queen captures, and then the rook moves to g1, defended by the knight. And you can see the Indian doesn't like this as much. It just says it's pretty much even, or even drawn for, maybe there's a perpetual check in there somewhere. But so yeah, queen to d4 is the best response if White goes for that pawn. And so that's why if Black decides to tickle the bishop, the most common response is, bishop to a4. Bishop to c4 is fine too, but if you wanted to play bishop to c4, why not just play it to begin with instead of bishop to d5? This maintains the idea of threatening and undermining the defender of e5, and that is one of the key ideas of this opening. And so after a6, bishop a4, then white will go ahead and play what he would have played anyway, which is knight to f6, again undermining the pawn, or not undermining, attacking, counterattacking the pawn. And then the usual continuation is castling. And here, for whatever reason, knight takes e4 is not played. Maybe just because if players want to play the open game, they're not going to play the a6 variant anyway. Maybe the bishop isn't as though black doesn't like having the bishop on. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe black prefers having the bishop on b5 in the open uh, Spanish game as opposed to a4. But by far the most common move. Ignore the engine turning off. The most common move here is bishop to e7, and it's a really subtle but very important and pretty much vital move here. And the reason for bishop to e7 is, as you saw in the open line, right around, where was it? Rook e, there, right around there. This pin is deadly, and so the pin on the e file. And so if black wants to capture that e pawn, then it should take steps to make sure that pin doesn't happen. And so you can see that with the move 5, 6, 4. So this is my first time doing a chess video, so I'm still getting used to the whole idea of real-time analysis. Let's do it by hand. And then knight, and then castle, and then... So this bishop to e7 move, that basically nullifies the effect of the pin. So now the next move, if white doesn't prevent it, then black will just capture the pawn on e4, and now all of a sudden white's strong pawn center is gone. And so white responds to this. Two main options are, d3. I guess there's three options: d3, rook to e1, or moving the queen to the e file. Again, like I said, d3 is not really a great move because we want to play d4 eventually. We want that strong pawn center, and we want to continue to undermine black's e pawn, or at least directly attack and try to destroy it. So rook to e1 is played. It's a great square for the rook anyway, just along that file, which will maybe be opened up eventually, and defending the pawn. At this point, now the tables turn into white's favor because white still has that idea of capturing the knight on c6, which will then the open up the pawn on e5 to be captured by the knight. And so again, you might say, well, why not just play d6? And again, that's playable, and it's at some point when that's played, it usually turns into like a Steinitz defense, I think is what it's called. But again, black might want to reserve that d pawn to play d5 because whatever white wants to do in this kind of somewhat symmetrical lines, it's going to be good for black too. So if black can get a d5 there, and in certain positions, it's the Marshall attack, which is a very strong sacrificial attack by black to get a mating attack on the castle king. That d5 is that impetus that opens the center up and takes away that central pawn from white and is really good for black. So d6, just like d3 is for white, is just kind of passive. So instead, white almost always plays this b5, and that has two benefits there, two pluses for black, which is always good. It it removes the bishop from the scene with a knight. The bishop has to flee to b3, and also it opens up this b7 square for the bishop, and in some lines, it's a very happy thing for him to be along that diagonal, attacking that e4 pawn again. So it's a very good move by black, and again, pretty much mandatory. And of course, it also gains space on the queen side, which is nice because in a lot of Spanish game lines, especially the closed Spanish game, white's counterplay is on the queen side because that's where white gets the space. Especially with typically the knight will move to a5 to again attack the bishop, and then c5 is played. The pawn moves to c5, and that really gives black a lot of space on the queen side. And even, let me just go ahead and just do some other moves just to show this. If it's a safe play right now, but usually isn't. And then let's just say that white plays c3, and then c5. Actually, no, c3 doesn't leave it. It's the Noah's Ark trap if he plays d3, we'll say. d3 and then c5, then this is the Noah's Ark trap. If white is not careful and just plays a nothing move, then I believe in this position, c4 traps and wins the bishop, because only thing you can do really is capture. No, actually, okay, so yeah, again, there are ways to avoid it, so that knight move actually prevented it, so let's just do a queen move there. So that will allow the Noah's Ark. No, again, it won't. So yeah, in some positions it allows it, in some it doesn't. Let's just say the bishop goes there. That, I believe, will allow the Noah's Ark trap, because then if you have c4, and then d takes, and then pawn takes, no, again, the bishop is free. So yeah, I don't really do the Noah's Ark trap, because most everyone knows about it, and they'll almost always play c3 right away, preventing the Noah's Ark trap. But that is an idea of this. The Noah's Ark trap, if you can see it, if you can do it, trapping that bishop with that chain of pawns along the light squares, so he doesn't know where to go and he's trapped. So that's an interesting idea. But back to where I was. Again, usually knight to a5. Oh, obviously knight to a5 is not played right away, because that would leave the e5 pawn hanging. So we can't do that yet. So what we do instead, there's two major branches here. You could either play d6 right away, and that defends the e5 pawn, and then knight to a5 is playable, and that could again, threaten the bishop and prepare for c5 and maybe even c4, getting total control of the queen side. But again, it's a passive, in a sense, it's kind of a passive move, because it blocks the bishop in, and also if we want to play d5 later on, we've wasted a tempo. So d6 is definitely it's one of the major branches, but castling is also equally playable, because this reserves d5, because then after c5 there is the martial attack, which actually is a pawn sacrifice, because the pawn takes, knight takes, knight takes, oops, not going to do that, knight takes, and rook takes. White's a pawn up, but look at the beautiful attacking lines that black has. Obviously, the bishop and the queen are well coordinated on the diagonal, and even typically, what usually happens is there's two main lines here, but a common one, the old martial attack, I think, was knight to f3 or f6, and then the rook can retreat. You probably should retreat because it's offside, it's in the middle of nowhere, and then, but actually no, sorry, the main line actually is just d4, just securing the center and getting more control. And then bishop to d6 is played, and then the rook might retreat, and then you can see that despite being a pawn up, black has beautiful attacking chances with things like knight to g5, bishop to b7, queen to h4, tons of opportunities here, excuse me, for black to attack. But on the other hand, white has more control of the center. White has a pawn advantage with its central pawn. So white's pluses certainly are very significant too, and so this is a playable game for white. But I thought I'd just show you that little sideline. But the other main line, again, let me see if I can find it. Oh, not that. d6, c3, castling, and now d4 is finally played. Actually, no. Usually, d4 could be played as playable, but white often plays h3 first. With the idea being that if d4 is played, then black can move his bishop to g4, and that undermines white's control of d4, and then maybe there's going to be some bad stuff happening on d4, especially, if white captures the knight. I mean, obviously can't do it now, but if d4 is played, bishop to g4, then if white is lazy and does, a non-move like that, then if black captures and white captures with the queen, then all of a sudden I believe it looks like white's down a pawn, and it's a fork of the queen and bishop. So that's very bad. So that is why it's typical for white to first play h3 before playing d4, and then at this point, I think black has a number of options. You can move the bishop to d7, you can play knight to a5, and then that c5 idea. And now you can see white has a lot of control of the center squares. And then, anyway, white will still play d4, even doesn't really care that c5 has been played. And this is just pretty much the end of the Spanish game opening. At this point, there's a number of different branches. We've entered the middle game, so depending on what kind of plan black and white wish to pursue, the moves will then differ from there. But you can see that all of the moves of this opening have had a very specific purpose, and they were all centered around controlling the center, namely by either attacking or defending those two E pawns, and then also preparing a D pawn push, either D4 or D5. And that is true for pretty much all the open games, is attacking E4 and E5 and defending E4 and E5, and then preparing D4 or D5 to really get control of the center. And that's just the classical style, is to occupy the center with pawns. And then you can see the other main ideas are, you know, developing the pieces to their proper squares. You don't quite see so much of that in this game because it's a Spanish game. It's very much attacking and counterattacking. So all the development is just with a threat, with an attack. But you still get to see where pieces go in a nice way. And then of course give the king to safety and castle in that way. So yeah, this is my first video. Hopefully it made sense. I didn't have too many mistakes there. So yeah, comments are welcome, and I should be making another one fairly soon. I might do the guess the move that one of my commenters recommended, which is playing the chess tempo guess the move, recording, and having a commentary as you do the moves. And yeah, I have a lot of fun doing that, and it seems like a great idea. So yeah, look forward to that. Yeah, thank you for watching.